All right, everyone, here we are in our second to last music presentation. This one's going to be a lot of fun, so I hope you've been able to hang in with me there to get to this point. We're going to be talking about jazz and swing, not as much as I'd like to. And then tomorrow what we're going to do, I wanted to talk about some aleatoric music and some other weird stuff from the 20th century, but we just don't have enough time, so we're going to just cover a couple more composers and talk a little bit about film music tomorrow is what we're going to do. But let's dive into this and let's talk a little bit about jazz. So, right now though, we need to figure out what period of history we're in and where jazz emerges. So, remember we talked about rag in the very early 20th century, late 19th. So this is kind of where it begins, but really takes off after World War I. So when World War I draws to a close, a lot of our European friends their nations are just wrecked. And they're financially struggling. And then, of course, in 1918, you have the breakout of the Spanish flu. That doesn't help things very much, which, of course, we deal with here. So we've been through this whole pandemic thing before. America, though, because World War I wasn't physically fought on our shores, we had a huge economic boom that came afterwards. The 1920s were a huge time of prosperity in America. And then, of course, 1929, stock market crashes, all comes crumbling down, and we literally go into the Great Depression, which we get out of basically, it really comes to a close at the start of World War II, because war is good for the economy, unfortunately. But music in a time of prosperity is a great place for people to spend their time and money, and in a time of economic depression, it's a form of escapism. This is also why films take off in a big way in the Great Depression, or right afterwards. Not only do we now have films with actual sound and music accompanying them, but people just need a way to escape. And so this is a big deal and a big shift in our culture at this time. The other thing that changes during this period is recording technology improves, so you don't have to be an operatic singer belting out for a recording device to pick you up. So music can now be singing can be more crooning and softer, and recording devices can pick you up. Now, the 1920s and the 1940s, this is a real golden era for Tin Pan Alley. You remember that section of New York where a lot of popular music publishers were located? Musical theater is on the rise, which I wish we had more time to cover. But you've got Hammerstein writing his first musical, Showboat, in the late 20s. And of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein eventually would become the duo that we know and love for so many musicals from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This is an era when Irving Berlin writes some of his most well-loved music, including White Christmas, which you probably all know. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. Or God Bless America. Again, both in that softer crooning style. He also wrote a lot of rag music, including Alexander's Ragtime Band. George Gershwin is also writing at this time, including his really famous Rhapsody in Blue and I've Got Rhythm, both of which are influenced by rag and jazz. What I'd like you to do is listen to some of Alexander's Ragtime Band, and this is sung by Ethel Merman, who was just a powerhouse singer, late 30s, 40s, and on into the 50s, 60s, even 70s. There's a great recording of her doing I've Got Rhythm in a disco style in the 70s, which is absolutely fabulous. But you're going to hear her voice is kind of, it's brash, the way she sings, but it's just a powerhouse, and she was a big deal for musicals during this time. Also, if you look up the musical There's No Business Like Show Business, from which we get the song There's No Business Like Show Business, sung by Ethel Merman again, you're also going to hear her do a great version of this song in a German polka style. But that's not the point. What I'd like you to do is, if you haven't heard it, listen to Alexander's Ragtime Band, listen to at least some of it, and then also if you haven't heard it before, listen to the opening clarinet solo from Rhapsody in Blue, which you probably know. This is the United Airlines has basically adopted this as their theme song. So, but listen to Alexander's Ragtime Band and listen to the very beginning, at least, of Rhapsody in Blue by Gershwin. Now, to get to jazz, we first have to start with blues. Blues are a type of music that emerged in the early 20th century, and they came out of African American rural work songs. but their distinct focus in the lyrics is overcoming difficulties, whether that's love lost or unemployment or oppression, whatever it might be. The characteristics of blues are syncopation, so you know 1 and 2 and 3, kind of like what we saw in rag, but you've got stress just before the strong beats. Da 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 da. So you've got that kind of like stress right before the pounding downbeat. You've got some, you see some improvisation in the melodic, in the melody. You've got a strophic style, so you've got a tune that repeats, but you've got new words that go with it. You've got what's called blue notes. Now this is really cool. So if you take, this usually happens on the 3rd, 6th, or 7th degree of the scale. You'd flatten those a little bit, or you'd fall off them, slide a little bit with them. So da da da, flatten it just a little bit, and this is very distinct in blues. The standard form of blues is a 12-bar form. Remember, form is the structure. 12 bars referring to 12 measures, and you've got the poem part of it, the text, in AAB. So what that means is there's an A part, then that A part repeats, and then there's a new B part. And the way the harmonic progression works, measures 1 through 4, remember this is 12 parts, so there's the first third, measures 1 through 4, you're working on your 1 chord. So you've got your melody going on over top of that, measures 1 through 4. Then you get to measures 5 through 6, we're doing A again, you're working off 4, then you go back down to 1 again, for measures 7 and 8, we're still in A. Then we move on to measure 9, and we move up to our 5 chord, for the B part, and back to 1. Of course, this could be in a minor key as well. Just depends. This is the structure of your, this is a standard structure for blues. Not all blues songs are set up this way, but this is a very standard structure that you're going to hear in the song that I'd like you to listen to. I want you to listen to Bessie Smith. She was the first African American to be recorded singing a blues song, very famous singer, and I want you to listen to her singing Backwater Blues. Listen to at least one verse, or stanza, if you want another word for it, and listen for that pattern that you're going to hear in there. You're going to hear it's just got the, standard in 1, back to 1 after we went to 4, then we go up to 5, and you've probably used that harmonic pattern, you guitar players, for other things as well. So I want you to listen to her Backwater Blues by Bessie Smith, and then come back and join us. Now, the reason we had to talk about blues before we got to jazz is that jazz took a lot of elements of the blues, such as anticipation of the beat, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, and also that improvisatory style, and mixes it with ragtime. Now, remember, rag also used that syncopation, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, but you're going to hear swinging happening instead, and you're also going to see musicians using lead sheets. These are just kind of general outlines, maybe a melody, some chords, instead of fully annotated music. Now swing, we need to talk about that. If we've got 8 notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, we can still syncopate them by how we accent them. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. But if we're going to swing them, we now change these, and handbells, you know we worked a lot on this year with one of our songs. We're going to change it from straight 8 notes to a long, short, long. Da, 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 da. It's still printed like 8 notes, but you're going to play it that way. And this is this is a product, this whole jazz style is a product of New Orleans, really, in a lot of ways. Because here in New Orleans, you not only have a mix of Caribbean, French, and Spanish cultures coming together, but this was really much the only place in the United States prior to emancipation and the Civil War that African Americans could publicly gather. So a lot of their musical traditions managed to survive here, where they died in other places in the country. And so all of that comes together to give us jazz, which was originally called New Orleans rag. Now, do you remember the Maple Leaf Rag when we listened to Scott Joplin playing that? Da 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 da. I want you to listen to it now, swung. Da 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 da. It's going to be swung now by a famous early jazz musician called Jelly Roll Morton. And you're going to hear the swing. You're going to hear some stopped beats as well. Anapestic beats is what they're called. But you're going to hear it's just going to be going. And you're going to hear that stop in it. You're going to hear the heavy hits before the strong beats. So that kind of leaning in before anticipating the beat. And you're going to hear along with improvisation. Instrumental jazz, on the other hand, takes all this and adds the idea of a solo or counterpoint lines improvising over top of a more consistent background, which we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I want you to listen to a jazzed up version of Maple Leaf Rag by this early jazz musician, Jelly Roll Morton. So take a listen to that. See if you can detect the differences in the rhythm between that and the way Scott Joplin originally played it. Now, one of the great names to come out of this jazz era is, it's probably a name you all know too, famous trumpet player Louie Armstrong. You probably know him for crooning and kind of croaking out, honestly, is "What a Wonderful World." If you've ever heard that croaky version, guarantee you that was Louie Armstrong singing it. But he began his career in New Orleans, like many jazz players, working with King Oliver. But later, that's just the name he went by. But then he followed King Oliver to Chicago, where he continued working for him until he formed his own band. And he did a lot of recordings with them. They were called the Hot 5 or the Hot 7, depending on how many people were in the band when they did the recording. A piece that exemplifies the great traits of jazz from this era is West End Blues, which was an Oliver piece that Armstrong took and did some great work with, and improvisation on the melody. It's based on a 12-bar blues piece again, so, you know, A, B, with that three-part A, B. And you're going to hear in it the structure of a jazz ensemble. Now, in a jazz combo, you've got what's called the front line. This is the melody section. This is going to usually be made up of a clarinet, a trumpet, and in some cases a trombone. And then you're going to hear what's called the rhythm section. This is the part that keeps the group together, and this is taken care of by percussion, by a piano, sometimes a banjo, and a double bass. Later the banjo, we'll see, would be replaced with the guitar. So you're going to hear also, if you, as you listen through this, and I would like you to listen to the whole thing, you're going to hear later on where Armstrong stops playing the trumpet and he alternates back and forth, kind of call and response almost, with the clarinet player. And he's going to do a little bit of what's called scat singing. Scat singing is this idea of where you just kind of sing imitating your instrument on syllables. You know, just singing on these syllables. So, I want you to first listen to at least a little bit of a vocal version of it, which more closely follows Oliver's original written out tune. And then I want you to listen all the way through Armstrong's version and listen for how he improvises, how he changes the melody, and his really cool, wild trumpet introduction to the piece. So, take a listen to a little bit of the vocal version and then Armstrong's version of West End Blues. Now, jazz inspired also a more organized form of music for bands, swing, which is a hard-driving jazz music that's written for swing dancing gatherings. Many elements of jazz stay in place, but the music usually is orchestrated out and planned. And if there's any improvisation, it's usually just by the soloists. Groups that played swing for dance halls were called big bands. Or swing orchestras, depending on the term you wanted. Some of the famous band leaders are listed below from this era. You've got Duke Ellington, he was a famous big band leader. Louie Armstrong, who we talked about, Fletcher Henderson, Count Basie, Paul Whiteman, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller. Blacks and whites together leading out in these jazz bands, these big bands. These big bands would include a brass section, a reed section, and a rhythm section. Brass section would have trumpets and trombones. Reeds would have clarinets and saxes, and the rhythm section would have a piano, drums, guitar at this point supplanted the banjo, and you'd have a double bass. And they could all play together, or the sections could take turns alternating with each other. Now, interestingly enough, we often associate jazz with 7th and 6th chords and other thick, lush chords like that. So this is a regular chord here. If I add an additional note just below the octave, that's a type of 7th. This is a major 7th, that's a minor 7th, and that naturally resolves to here. Then you've got chords with 6ths in them. That's a major chord. So you've got these chords that have these extra thick notes in them, and we often associate jazz as having given us that. But in reality, that is Debussy and Ravel giving that to jazz. So jazz actually took from them. And when we talk a little bit about Duke Ellington in a minute, we're going to find out that one of his greatest inspirations was Debussy. So what I'd like you to listen to is a little bit of Sing, Sing, Sing by the Benny Goodman Orchestra. You're probably going to recognize it. It's a great example of 30s swing music, and it's right up there with In the Mood, which is another one you might recognize. It's from the Glenn Miller Orchestra. So take a listen to Sing, Sing, Sing for some big band swing by the Benny Goodman Orchestra. All right, and the last thing and person we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about one of the most influential composers of the jazz age, Edward Kennedy Ellington, or Duke Ellington as he was called. He began his career in New York, really, in Harlem at the Cotton Club. And this job here gave him the security to do some experimenting and more rehearsing with his group. And we're going to see that paid off big time in a little bit. He was inspired by Debussy, Stravinsky, and Gershwin. He was born in Washington, D.C., son of a butler in the White House. He studied piano and ragtime, and he played at clubs, and then eventually began taking his group on tours. And in the 50s and 60s, he even toured internationally on behalf of the United States State Department. Cottontail is a great example of his work in jazz, and it's from the 1940s. It uses the harmonic progression of Gershwin's I've Got Rhythm, but writes completely new tunes, now called choruses. So, you can listen to I've Got Rhythm if you'd like, but I'd like you to then listen to Cottontail by Duke Ellington's group. And enjoy, and I'll see you tomorrow.